Hello again, this is Miscellaneous Mischief 48, and I'm back with another Blender tutorial. This time, I'm going to be showing you how to rig the valve gear of a steam locomotive. Now, this tutorial is going to be a little different. Instead of going just one way, I'm going to be showing you how to rig 3 different styles of valve gear. You can call these difficulties. There will be a beginner's tutorial where we learn how to rig a very simple and generic valve gear setup, which is basically just one long coupling rod. Fairly simple. In the intermediate tutorial, we'll go over a valve gear setup that not only has a coupling rod, but a connecting rod, a crosshead, and sidebars as well. Now for the expert tutorial, we're going to completely buckle down and rig Rolfskertz's highly detailed valve gear design. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a while for the expert tutorial, as that is still currently in the modeling stage. But today, let's slow down and start off nice and easy with the beginner's tutorial. Okay, so here we have our basic and generic valve gear setup. So what we're going to want to do first is, of course, create an armature. Select single bone, then tap into edit mode. Rotate it along the x-axis by 90 degrees. Let's go ahead and drag this in. Now the reason I have that big bone at the origin, it's because for every 3D model that you rig, there always has to be a root bone. That one bone that does all the transformations for the entire object, like moving it around, rotating it, scaling it, what have you. Now let's go and rename this armature to valve. Actually, you know what? Let's just name this arm underscore valve big for beginner. Then we're going to go into the bone tab and rename this bone to root. So now what we're going to do is to create a bone for the drive wheel, so that the drive wheel can rotate with this bone. So what we're going to do is that we're going to click on our drive wheel, tab into edit mode, and we're going to find the center, which is where the pivot point is. So we're going to press Shift S, and then we're going to press cursor to select it, so that the 3D cursor is centered on the pivot point. Now we're going to click on our armature, tap into edit mode, and press Shift A to create a new bone. We're going to drag this down along the Z-axis while we move this out, as we're going to only rotate the left side first. Let's go ahead and drag this up so it matches the diameter a little. We're going to tab out, and then we're going to go into pose mode. Let's rotate this along the x-axis. Perfect. And the bone rolls at 0 degrees. Alright, so we're off to a good start. Now we're going to select our middle drive wheel, and then select this bone, press Ctrl P, and then parent it to armature to form with empty groups. Now we're going to select our wheel, and then go into the vertex tab, and then over here where it says root and bone, whoops, I forgot to rename this to rotation.L. Now we're going to select our drive wheel, make sure you press A to select everything. You can press A again to deselect. So let's press A again to select everything. Then we're going to the vertex tab, and then we're going to assign all of these vertices to the rotation.L bone. I'm going to click assign, and then press A to deselect everything and tap back into object mode. And then now, when we click on our rotation bone and rotate it along the x-axis, you can see that our drive wheel follows it. Alright, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to click on our front wheel, then we're going to go into the Object Constraints tab up here, and then put a copy rotation constraint. Then we're going to choose our target, which is the armature, and rotation.L. And we're going to set this to local space, both drop-down menus. Now when we rotate this bone, the front wheel rotates with the center drive wheel. And now we're going to choose our rear wheel and do the same thing. Go into the Object Constraints tab, add a copy rotation, select the armature for our target, and for the bone, rotation.L, set these two to local space. And now we have all of the wheels on the left side rotating with this rotation bone. And now we're going to make this coupling rod move with the drive wheels, so it moves in synchronicity, or whatever you like to call it. First, what we're going to do is that we're going to make sure that this front crank pin is a separate object. As you can see, I already separated mine, but I'm going to go ahead and reconnect it to this coupling rod, and we're going to tab into edit mode and select the crank pin by hovering over it and pressing L. Then we're going to press Ctrl V and go to separate by selection. Now, your coupling rod and crank pins may look different on your model, but basically all you do is just select the crank pin and then you separate it by selection. Same method. Now we're going to tap back into object mode and select the crank pin. And we're going to make sure that the origin is in the center of that crank pin. To make sure, we're going to tab into edit mode and select, let's select these front edge loops by pressing B to box select, and then left click and drag. Now we're going to press Shift S and set the cursor to selected. We're going to tap back into object mode, and then we're going to press T to pull up this window. And then over here where it says Set Origin, click on it and set the origin to 3D cursor. Now the origin of the crank pin is right where it should be. Now we're going to select our coupling rod and we're going to set the origin to the 3D cursor also. Okay, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to parent the crank pin to this front wheel. And to do that, we're going to shift select this front wheel and press Ctrl P and parent it to the object. Now when we rotate this bone, the crank pin should follow the rotation of the front wheel. And there we go. You can see it right there. Alright, now we're going to make this coupling rod follow the crank pin. And the way we're going to do that is to add a copy location constraint. We're going to set our target to crank pin. Oh, hold on. Let's gotta rename this object to crank pin.L. Now we're going to select our coupling rod, go into the Object Constraints tab, and set our target to crank pin.L. Now the coupling rod should follow perfectly. There we go. And in order to make sure that the coupling rod doesn't start going all over the place, we're going to add we're going to add a limit rotation constraint, and then just check all of these, and make sure we set this to local space. And there we go. There's the entire left side of the chassis rigged. Now we're going to cover the right side. Okay, yes, I'm not a locomotive expert, but I sure know, but I'm not too sure of this, but I think that on a real locomotive, these wheels are rotated 45 degrees off of this side. So like let's say this side is like this, then this right side is really like this. Sorry, it's really like this. Rotated 90 degrees. Or like that. I don't know, it's just the way I modeled it. I basically just duplicated these objects and then mirrored it over across the x-axis. But don't worry, we'll figure out how to get that quartering effect in a little bit. But first, what we're going to do is that we're going to select this bone and then press Shift C to set the cursor to the origin. Then we're going to press Shift D and then press Control M and X. Hold on. Before you do that, over here where it says the pivot center for rotation and scaling, we're going to click on it and then set the pivot point to 3D cursor. Now we're going to press Shift D to duplicate it, then press Control M and X to mirror it along the X-axis. And to make sure that it's completely mirrored, you can go over here to where it says armature, click on it, and then press this little option called Flip Names. And it automatically changes the .L to .R. Pretty neat feature. So now we're going to select this right drive wheel, and then select this bone, press Ctrl P and parent it with empty groups. Now we're going to select the wheel, go into the vertex tab, and then assign all of the vertices to rotation.R. Let's just make sure. Whoops. Forgot to set this back to median point. Set this back to median point. Now let's rotate this. There we go. Now we're going to do the same thing that we did here on the left side. We're going to get the front drive wheel and then go to the Object Constraints tab and add a copy rotation constraint. Set our target to the armature and the rotation.R bone. Set these to local space. And then we're going to go to the back wheel or the rear wheel and then add another copy rotation constraint. Set our target to the armature. Go to rotation.L, set these to local space. Alright, that's looking really good. Now we're going to separate the crank pin from the coupling rod. Oops. As you can see, I already separated the crank pin from the coupling rod, but don't worry, you should know how to do that by now. But to make sure, we're going to set the origin of the crank pin where it should be by pressing Shift S and then cursor to selected. We're going to go to Object Mode and set the origin to 3D cursor. And now we're going to do the same thing for the coupling rod. We're going to select it, then set the origin to the 3D cursor. Alright, now everything is where it should be. Now we're going to select the crank pin, and then Shift select the leading right wheel, and then press Ctrl P and parent it to the object. Now we're going to select the coupling rod and add a copy location constraint. Set the target to crankpin.R and then leave it as world space. And just to make sure, we're going to add a limit rotation constraint and check all of these and set this to local space. And there we go. There's the right side rigged. Now there's that quartering effect I want to talk to you about. Okay, so first we're going to grab these and then lower them down a little. Now we're going to select this drive wheel, press Shift S, press cursor to selected to set the 3D cursor to that pivot point, and we're going to select our armature, tab into edit mode, and make a new bone by pressing Shift A. Then we're going to lower this down a little bit to it's roughly the diameter of the drive wheel. And this will be our main rotation, the rotation that rotates all of the wheels, the entire chassis. We're going to select this and rename this to wheels. Okay, so before we do that, first let's set the rotation of this bone to 90 degrees off by pressing R, X, -90. Whoops, sorry. Nope, that's correct. Sorry, my bad. That's correct. And now we're going to select this bone, go into the Bone Constraints tab, and add a Copy Rotation constraint. This time we're going to set the target to the armature, and the bone will be the wheels bone. Just in case, we're going to set this to local space, both of these. Then we're going to do the same thing on this bone, adding another copy rotation. Set this to the wheels tab. Set these to local space. And if it comes out to the way it was before, then just click offset. That should work. And now, in order for this root bone to control everything, we're going to go and tab into edit mode, and then select these bones, and then you shift select the root bone, press Ctrl P, and then parent them but keep them offset. Now when you move the root bone, okay, we're gonna get to that part later. First, we need to make sure that this copy rotation stuff worked. We're gonna select the wheels bone, and then rotate it along the x-axis. And there we go. We get this neat effect. This wheels bone now rotates every single wheel plus the coupling rods. Okay, so now, lastly, we're going to parent all of these objects to the root bone so that we can move them forward and back and stuff like that. As you can see, the drive wheels are already parented to the root bone thanks to these bones. But let's go ahead and parent the rest of the objects. So what we're going to do is that we're going to select each wheel and then shift select the root bone, press Ctrl P, parent them to empty groups. And we're going to select this drive wheel, tab into edit mode, select all the vertices, and make sure that we have this set to root, and then assign them. Then we're going to do the same to the rest of the wheels. You seem to have encountered a little problem here. Let me see if I can fix that. I wonder if we reset this rotation. And then we deselect the offset. There we go. Okay, so now before we set the quartering effect, then we click on offset, we need to parent all the objects to the root bone first. So let's select all these vertices. This root. We'll do the same thing for this wheel. Oops, sorry. And now it's working like it should. I'm going to select these and assign these to the root. There we go. Now we're going to assign the coupling rods and the crank pin. So we're going to select the crank pin and then parent it with empty groups. Assign these to the root. Let's do the same thing for the other crank pin. And now for the coupling rods. Okay, so now if we move the root bone, everything should follow it. There we go, just like that. Okay, and my wheels appear to have a subdivision surface modifier, so for the sake of CPU usage, I'll go ahead and turn that off. Yeah, they're pretty low poly. There we go, now it's a little smoother. Let me go ahead and turn it off for the coupling rods and the crank pin as well. Okay, now let's try and move this root bone now. There we go, that's super smooth, super smooth. Let's just recheck this. And as you can see, the coupling rod and the crank pin stop following the wheel. But don't worry, there's an easy fix to that. let's just reparent the crank pins to their respective wheels by parenting them to object. There we go. Now it should work again. There we go. Alright. Now we're going to see if that quartering effect will work now. Let's go ahead and rotate it on the x-axis by... Whoops. Rotate it along the x-axis by negative 90 degrees. This time, let's try applying this rotation. Apply it as rest pose. Okay, scratch that, never mind. Let's add that copy rotation constraint. Set the target to the armature and wheels. This to local space, and offset. And with the offset on, it still didn't affect anything. As you can see that it moves just fine with the root bone. Now we rotate this. It has that nice quartering effect. And now our chassis is completely rigged. Well, that concludes the beginner's tutorial of the valve gear rigging session. And stay tuned for the intermediate tutorial coming soon. See you all next time.